Hi everybody, it's great to be here for episode 5, yes. And today, obviously, hanging around, Gary Twining, my oppo, as it were, and the marvellous Mark Burton-Wood, who, believe it or not, folks, he's in Dubai, so I'm not actually all that pleased with him because it's about 5 degrees here, and I believe it's about 28 over there. So he's warm, we're cold, so we'll crack on. Anyway, long and the short of it is Mark's here to talk about the ACS and the new ACS system. So without further ado, Gary, would you sort of like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Much appreciated that. Morning, how you all doing? First of all, the new ACS scheme, what's different from the old? There you go.
Yeah, it's straight to the point, Gary. Yeah, thanks for that.
Not going to
I'll just give you a bit of context, I think, and I won't whistle on for too long. We all know the existing scheme's been around for around 20 years now, something like that. And I think over that period of time, it's fair to say that probably expectations on the industry have changed a little. You know, risk, threat, and harm's changed. The involvement that private security has in public protection has increased, I think. You know, I sometimes say when I'm asked to talk about this that, you know, the majority of us now going about our 24-hour day-to-day business will come into contact with private security. You know, if you're going from A to B, you will do. And I've said this in the past, and I've said, well, I've never seen anyone. You know, I've never seen a security officer. So you may pass through CCTV, you may, you know, a railway station, you will contact. So it's out there, so that risk, threat, and harm has changed. I think the other thing as well is that the way the industry operates, the operating models in the industry have changed. You know, it doesn't work it's not in a vacuum in terms of economies, is it? The security industry. And just as you see things like labour supply changing in other sectors, then we see it happening in the industry. So things have moved on. And whilst the scheme's been around 20 years and there's been tweaks over the years and reviews of it, I think there was a decision. Well, I do know there was a decision. Just take a step back and say, well, have we got this strategy right in terms of what the scheme is trying to achieve? So I think if you were to ask me to sum it up and say, well, what is the most fundamental difference that you'll see in the scheme? And this is me speaking personally, not the SIA. I would say that you'll see a greater emphasis on when companies are assessed, is very much assessing the service delivery that they provide. And how that will feel different is this concept of saying, well, the service they're providing, is it actually mitigating the risk that they're there to address? You know, someone buys security, and generally they're buying security to mitigate a risk or a threat to people, places, or property. Now, if this is a seal of approval from the government, then the government should be satisfied, or the regulator should be satisfied, that they're providing a service that is actually meeting that risk or threat, and particularly where there's an element of public protection. So I think that's where it will feel so different. So if you think about that from an assessment perspective, everybody who's familiar with the scheme knows that there's a good, you know, if you look at a good 80% of that assessment currently is looking at policy, process. Have you got a business plan in place, which is important because it's a holistic scheme. And if you're fortunate, probably 20% looks at service delivery, probably less. So there's going to see a bit of a reversal where greater emphasis on is the service doing what it says on the tin, but not neglecting the fact that businesses should have these things in place. So I think that's how it may feel different to people, Gary. And there's a lot of, you know, the strategy underpinning it as to why it's felt that change is necessary. I can talk about later.
Can I just say there, just as somebody who actually I was managing director of a company and took that through the ACS process, and you're spot on, Mark. You know, my overall feeling from the whole thing, from the moment you started the process, is it was all very, very much predominantly a tick box event. So have you got this? Have you got that? Have you got the other? It didn't focus on whether or not your people or your company was actually able to service the contract in a way that the customer required, essentially, was the essential outcome, i.e. public service, achieved. So that's just my practical experience. But Gary, you know, yours.
So what we're saying is we're now looking at the service level rather than being in an internal office level where the paperwork it was a paperwork exercise, as we're aware. I did do it once, and it was a tick box, make sure everyone's in play. You've got that, but what you're saying now is now looking at the people on the ground, what service they're providing. That's the point you're making there?
It is, Gary. I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, the strategy. I was asked to go back to the SIA for 12 months to write a strategy, and you know, the remit I was given was, you know, it's got to be sure that public protection is front and centre of what the new scheme does. So I think it's worth recognising that there's a strategy being written. From that strategy, there's almost not a straw man as such. There's 5 pillars that came out of it, and that was the primary one. And currently, they're going through the design phase of what the scheme will look like in reality, you know, with those principles, that being one of them. And, you know, what will be coming out shortly, and I still speak to people who's involved in developing this, you know, the actual scheme itself, as opposed to the strategy, is that in the very near future, there's going to be public consultation. And I think that's when the industry really needs to get involved with that consultation. And, you know, as I've said many times, the industry really needs to have its voice heard then. You know, there's been a lot of consultation up until now to see what the challenges are, you know, and some of them the both of you will be very familiar with. You know, people said to me, it's got to address the labour supply problems, the extended labour supply chains, how that waters down any approval scheme that you've got. So the strategy was written by listening to the industry. And I think when they start to move to that design phase, it's so important that the industry has an input into that. And I know that they're going to do it by way of, you know, an online consultation. But I was speaking to Steve McCormick, the director who's responsible for that area of business, and they're going to go out on the road again, you know, around the UK. So I'd urge everyone and everybody, get involved in that consultation and shape it.
Well, you know, I'm signed up already with Julie Birchall from the SIA for that consultation.
So on this thing, so when are we looking this to be really developed? Because everyone's still in the old ROTS system at the moment. I mean, when they look the new system out,
people normally not roll their eyes when I say this, Gary, but it'll be, in reality, I think it'll be around 2027 when it's fully on to the new scheme.
Right.
But you know, you've got to think about, when I said the scheme's been around for 20 years, it's not a light switch moment, this, isn't it? You can't just switch everyone over if it's a whole new strategy and a whole new way of doing things, you know, because one of the other things that the scheme, the other central pillar of the scheme as well, is that the approval actually recognises what that business does. Because currently we've got a register that's got something like 800 businesses on. And in reality, if you go down that 800 businesses, you can't differentiate them, in my view, if you're just looking at that register. You know, it's almost like you're snowblinded by them. Now, we should be, as a regulator, the SIA should be able to recognise businesses in terms of their capacity, their capability, any specialisms that they provide. You know, now people say, well, how can you do that? Because they can only approve companies for the sectors that the SIA licenses. So door supervision, security guarding, CCTV, key holding, etc. But the SIA has got the capability, when they're saying those companies are approved for that, but they can also recognise, for example, if they're specialists in, let's say, for example, dog handling, or the specialists in something, events. There is scope, I believe, for them to do that. And I think that's important, that it really starts to portray exactly, you know, from an approval perspective, it's not just, you know, this rubber stamp which says, yes, you're approved, that actually there's recognition of capacity, capability, and any specialisms that business can provide. And I think that's important for smaller businesses as well.
Yeah, but because you're saying that's currently not in play. This is what could
that's
be done.
currently not in play. If you look at the register, it just very much says, approved for this sector. Which are the sectors that they license people for, basically. And that's the other difference. But I think what will come with that, just the last point I'll make, is the other thing that they want to achieve in the future with the new scheme is that if they are able to say, well, we approve this company because the service that it provides mitigates the risk that they've been engaged to address. What's also a pillar of the new strategy is that other agencies recognize the scheme. And by other agencies, I mean people like MPSA or CPNI, as they were, NACSO, the police, local authorities, that people recognize that brand, that government approval. Because I think currently, this is my own personal view, it doesn't feel like a government approval. It feels like there's nothing wrong with these other schemes I'm going to mention, but it sits alongside ISO, it sits alongside investing people. It really should be seen as the government regulator's approval of that business. So it should be recognised by those other public protection agencies. Because at the end of the day, the SIA's responsibility is public protection. That's why they're there at the end of the day. So why can't the scheme that they approve have that formal recognition of those other public protection agencies? And I think that would raise the standing of any scheme then, locally, nationally, and also overseas as well.
I agree with that. It would certainly spin it off. I mean, it's got a dark, let's say dark. It's got one of those things where people don't view the ACS as a credible scheme.
Yeah,
and this one of my other questions, George, is why should you go for the ACS when people don't see it as a credible scheme? What is the real benefit of having that? As you said, a lot of these agencies don't recognise that. So what is the benefit for having the ACS?
Yeah, and I'm going to be really upfront with you now, guys. When I've been asked that question over the years, sometimes it's difficult to answer. It is difficult to answer. I can say, well, it gives you access to contracts, and I think it does. I think more so now. A few years ago, people would say, well, nobody stipulates ACS. I think they do now. And we're seeing it in a sector that's important to that when you talk about you wanted to get recognition, and I apologize for using door supervisor sector, when you want recognition for what they do. I know that some of the big buyers in that sector are now stipulating ACS, which would have been unheard of previously. So I think it does give you access to contracts that you wouldn't ordinarily get. I think not so much as it used to do. There is a network feeling around it. You're in a group with like-minded businesses, the majority of them. Every year it's a health check for your business, depending on the quality of the assessment. But I would say that there is an opportunity here with the new strategy and the new scheme to really drive home what those benefits are. And for me, and I know that this may sound a little controversial, but whenever I've been asked about the benefits, it's always been from a supplier's perspective. People say to me, well, what's in it for me? And I can talk about those access to contracts. But really the benefits of any government approval scheme should be for all the stakeholders. They should be clearly defined for the suppliers. They should be clearly defined for the buyers. They should clearly be defined for those other stakeholders we've mentioned, those public protection agencies and the public itself. So I'm not shirking it, Gary. I think as part of this new strategy, as part of this new scheme, that's got to be central as well, that you quantify what the benefits actually are. Because the current scheme, there are benefits that I've touched on there, but sometimes it's very difficult to convince people, exactly, do those benefits realize? Do they actually realize for me at the end of the day as a supplier? And I speak to, I speak to a lot of companies. I'll just finish off.
Sorry.
And I think they tend to sit in two camps, really, Ian and Gary. You get those who will articulate the benefits of being in the scheme all the time. There's some businesses out there, if you cut the business in half, it's got ACS through its core. There are some businesses who've been around a long time, so there's nothing in it for me. That can't be right, can it? That can't be right. And it can't be right that I sit here today and say, well, these are some of the perceived benefits, but are they really benefits?
The question I just wanted to ask there is, I think the I mean, I've always been a fan of the ACS, which is why I drove the company that I ran to actually achieve it. And it did achieve the benefits that it, that were there on the can. But I just wonder, and maybe Gary could add on this, about the pandemic, the lack of labour supply, therefore government departments which were supposed to support the ACS have now, through need, have actually had to go and get whatever labour supply they can get in order to achieve that. Gary, did you find this?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we weren't an ACS company during the pandemic, but we were pulled in for factors because of our qualifications and of our staff standards, which, at the time, our staff were more qualified than what was set out by the ACS. So yeah, I mean, but there was a scramble for anything they can get out on the ground, and it showed.
Yeah,
it did show out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a fair point, and that came out loud and clear when I was involved in, that engagement with the industry. As I said, when we were writing the strategy, we spoke to some big buyers, particularly in that public protection sphere. And, what we were asking them, what are the challenges for any business approval scheme? And they were saying what you just said, Gary. They said the problem is now that, I remember one guy saying to me, I could engage with an approved contractor and ask them to supply me with 100 staff, and I might get 50 of their staff. But after that, I might get 10 from another company, 10 from another company, 10 from another company. So if an approved contractor is saying to me, all our staff are trained to this level and so on and so forth, they said, I wasn't finding that. By the time I got to the end, they were just people that, it's not subcontracting. It was companies that were acting as labour supply. And I think, well, I don't think, when I've talked about, these central pillars, one of them is that any future scheme needs to recognise that that's the way the industry is operating. Now, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, but that's the way it's operating. So any future scheme needs to be able to accommodate that way of working. Because I'm not condoning, Gary, I'm not condoning when you get to the bottom of these chains where people are being paid less than minimum wage, where people are working extended hours. Even the good of the industry, that's the way they operate now to fulfill some of the contracts. And that's why I think it's important schemes recognise, or it's obvious from businesses in the scheme, what are the capability, what the capacity is, and the scheme actually, embraces that way of working, but make sure that it's comfortable to approve businesses that are operating in that way, is the way I see it. And I see you can't break that model now because it's here.
No, you can't, and it's sort of set in stone. But say there's nothing we can do about it at the moment. But hopefully, over the years, things might change.
Yeah.
But taking it back to the scheme itself, as I say, one thing that I find very frustrating with the SIA and down to badges and even down to the ACS, which we talked about, is how it's divided up. As you say, key holding, door supervisor, close protection, man guarding. Why has it got to be all like that? Why can't it just be under one system where everyone works together? Because I don't quite understand the concept. So I say, we only do key holding, but it's still part of security. We only do DS. Why can it not be all put in one unit where it becomes that is what security is about. This is security.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you make, Gary, and a really good question you ask. The problem that we have is the legislation that actually is in place to regulate the industry, which is an act from over 20 odd years ago, the 2001 Act. And the Act says that the SIA will license people in those sectors. And, for each one, they'll sector guarding, and it defines what that is. A license for this, a license for that. The only conflation you'd say that there is this, where CP can do DS, and there's a lot of angst over that, isn't there? Quite rightly sometimes. Are they the same skills? Probably not. But that's what's driving that, Gary. And I think, I do know that we know for business licensing there would be a need for a change in legislation to allow that to be in place. That's the opportunity. And I'm convinced the SIA will do this, not just to say, give us some legislation for business licensing. It would be an act which would actually tidy all this up, which 25 years, 30 years ago when the act was wrote, it was probably right, probably felt right then, the way it was done then. Because I do think that, it's difficult to look back 30 years and say, well, you got it all wrong. They did what they thought was right then, didn't they? And I'm not condoning it.
Yeah. I'm going to disagree with you because 30 years ago, as you know, I've been in the industry 38 years. I was there at the beginning of it all. And
you're one of them telling they got it wrong.
Yeah. I said, it's too spaced out, but no one's going to listen to me. I was only just a DS at that point. I was just security, but I looked at it and went, this is just not right. This is just not working for us. This is.
But to answer your question, Gary, I agree with you. It's too disjointed, but it's going to need this shift towards some legislation that allows you to join all those dots up. Really, is the way I see it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I always said the legislation, if we look at the legislation, it's got so many gaps and holes in it. It is ridiculous, even down to what was it? I'll give you a prime example for my side. I let my CCTV license lapse during the COVID thing, tried to get up, and then eventually when it got up and running, I missed out. So I went back and went, I want my CCTV license. You've been out of it for 3 years. Well, and then they went to me, well, your qualification's out of date. And I went, well, how? I said, there's my qualification. Where does it say on the paperwork? It doesn't say it's out of date. And, it's just one of those dull things. And the reply was, well, the legislation states,
and that is a problem that, what governs the SIA is the legislation that gives it the authority to act, to be there, really, because people sometimes forget that if you look right at the start of the Act, the first thing it says is that there will be a regulator, and it will regulate in this way. And I think the SIA, I'm not defending them. I'm not saying everything's good. I think the SIA pushed the boundary with that legislation sometimes. When you look at some of the prosecutions they do now, they've really pushed the boundary in terms of saying, well, if we feel it's criminality that impacts on our area of business, then we'll take action. They've gone to Proceed to Crime Act now. They're pushing the boundary, but what it needs, let's be frank, guys, what it needs is a whole new act, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And if we had better legislation, a new act, I mean, I could see, I wasn't for business licensing. I wasn't one of those people, but Ian did convince me, twisted my arm, put my head down, and forced me to believe in it. No, but the points are, for me, business licensing the way forward. I'm not over keen on the ACS scheme. I really haven't. We done it back several years ago. We ended up getting our money back because I wasn't impressed by it works. But I do see the point of it. I do see why it's important. I do have an understanding for it. And it's one of the things, it's my wife's company, she plans to do this year, start getting that into play. But I feel that there needs to be, more change into it. And as you said, licensing legislation and the change for it to really work, because it is, the ship hull is so porous it's still ridiculous. You know, there's something like 4,000 security companies out there, and only 800 ACS.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think that the premise right at the start, Ian and Gary, was that you know, the model of regulation, when you look all over the world, you know, and I've done some research on it, you either have that you mandate through business licensing, or you have a voluntary approach. And where there's a voluntary approach, what they're hoping is that you'll get to that critical mass that actually the industry is regulated anyway. I think we can safely say after 20 years that isn't going to happen in the UK.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think it should have been mandated, because if it had been mandated, we wouldn't have so much rubbish out there at the moment, and perhaps the training would be a lot better, and there wouldn't be so many holes to keep plugging. And it is, you know, I'm not saying it's a sinking ship. I just
You tell me another regulator. You tell me another regulator that isn't cited on everyone that operates in that sector. So if you want to open a betting shop, you've got to tell the regulator.
Yeah.
If you want to open a nursing home, you've got to tell the regulator. If you want to open a security business, you don't need to tell the regulator.
No.
And for me, fundamentally, that's the problem.
Yeah. And that's the daft thing about it. You know, I've never been a big fan of the SIA. I've always said that. I've stated that early days. I see they are a necessity. They do need to be there. But as we said earlier on, there needs to be a proactive regulator. I do understand their hands are tied. I do understand through the legislation. But I'd like to see them, again, before we're back to the same wording, same term, is legislation. I want them to be a full-on proper regulator out there and being able to do that. And we understand it done. You know, and this is why, you know, the ACS, you know, even though I'm not a big fan of it, you know, I think it is important to be out there and to have this scheme. And as you said, you're looking at 2027 for the new stuff to come out. I mean, it's still a long time. But, you know, for us to change the way it is, you know, we do need momentum. And this is one of the things why the Guest Safety Officer Group is running. And, you know, it does need that momentum.
What's built into it as well, Gary, during that period of time is that, I know Michelle Russell has said, and the SIA board have said, and again, I'm not speaking for them because I don't work for them, that, you know, they've been quite clear that during that period of time, if there are changes that can be made beforehand, they need to be made. So it's almost like fast tracking anything, you know, so rather than it being a cliff edge in 2027, this year, if so actually we can include that now, let's do it.
Yeah.
Actually, if we include that now, let's do it. Which I think is a mature way of looking at it, really. You know, so as you said, so, you know, let's move at pace. We realise that, you know, if it's a big change, you know, the companies have invested 20 years in this. We can't expect them to change overnight. But if the things that we feel are important that need to be done now, then let's fast track them in. Just leave you with another thought. And I don't know the answer to this, but it's talked about ACS sitting alongside other standards, and I think it should be seen as different to that. But how many other standards, do you know, business standards, do you hear people keep harping on about it being voluntary? So if you got ISO, do people say, I've got a voluntary IS standard in business standard? If you've got investing people, do say, I've got a voluntary. Why do we say it's voluntary? Now, you'd say, well, that shows that the company's actually been prepared to put their parapet. But for me, it waters it down from the outset. We know it's voluntary, but all the other schemes are voluntary. Nobody says that it
right.
is.
And it's a cost.
And that was something that said to me from a few people, why do you keep saying it's voluntary? Well, the Act says it has to be a voluntary scheme. It doesn't matter if the Act says that. Why do you say it's voluntary?
Totally agree. The bottom line on this, Mark, and I want to sort of just encapsulate what you just said there, is the ACS scheme as it is shouldn't matter it should be the gold standard scheme that every single person wants to sign up on, whether it's voluntary or it isn't. It doesn't, you know, you should be going, I need to be in this. This for business, for my business, for my profit. And I do think that the changes in the changes as a result of the Protection of Premises Bill, Martyns Law, that's coming through, you know, will change C-suite mentality towards the liability that they then face. You know, because
I think, I agree with you, and I think that the principle, you know, look, it's far, far more important than, you know, either what we're talking about now. But the principle of the protectorate, Martyns Law, whatever we want to call it, is very much similar to what I started off talking about. The principle of Martyns Law, isn't it, is that really, you know, if you're supplying a service, then you should mitigate the risks to those people that use that service.
Yeah.
You know, what the centre pillar of the strategy that's underpinning development of a new approved contractor scheme is very much, if you're going to approve a company, what are you approving them for? You're approving them to say that they're capable of doing what it says on the tin.
Yeah.
Not that they can write a good business plan, not that they can write a good process or a policy. What does it look like at the end?
Yeah.
So the two really should support each other. And, you know, let's see, and I'm conscious of time, Ian and Gary, but let's see in terms of parliamentary time, what happens with Martyns Law.
One final thing. I think it's really important, and I'm just interested in your perspective about Michelle Russell and her letter to Sir John Saunders and the Manchester Arena inquiry. That was a hell of a letter for someone in her position as a government official to write, I thought, because you know, she made it quite clear that she wanted the government's support on business licensing on behalf of the SIA and for the wider industry. Do you think that was a positive thing for her to say on behalf of the industry?
I do, in plain, I do think it's a positive thing to say, you know, on several fronts. I think she was, in first and foremost, she was saying it as a regulator. I can't speak for Michelle, I'm sure, you know, and far be it for me to do so. But I think she was saying it from the position of a regulator. You know, effective regulation moving forward, this is what we need. But those of you that have heard Michelle speak, you also know that front and centre of everything she wants to do is around public protection. So whilst it would be first and foremost as a regulator, this is what I think we need, it would be first and foremost, we need this for public protection. Because that's where it came from, the MIA inquiry, didn't it? That's what it was about. How do we protect the public moving forward? And of course, she is speaking for the industry as well, the industry that she's responsible for regulating. But again, I think there's to say it was important to write that letter. It was because she was also responding to a recommendation from a public inquiry that fell firmly at her doorstep.
Yeah.
You know, let's think about it. That recommendation was for the SIA, really. And she's saying, this is what we've proposed to meet the recommendation. But unfortunately, we can't progress it because of a decision that's been made elsewhere.
Yes.
So brave not brave, I think important, and well done for doing it.
Yeah.
100%. Agree with you
100%. It'd be interested to see what Sean Hipgrave comes back with. About it, being as he did tell Sir John that he was going to be coming, that they had something else in mind that would cover this, or certainly gave that impression. But anyway, Gary, have you got any final thoughts or questions?
Well, final thoughts. We all agree the ACS scheme is important. We all agree that legislation does need to be changed. It's always a thumbs up for me when we're approving stuff and getting things. We all agree on the same thing. It's just getting the people out there to see that point, and that is it on myself. Mark, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate you coming.
I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to me. I mean, I've been involved in public protection for 40 odd years now, and I really enjoy these discussions. My final thought is probably something I started off with at the beginning. I think it's so important, by way of what you've got here yourself with the Guest Safety Officer Forum and other forums, that the industry has a voice, because you touched on there in the letter that Michelle wrote. I think it's important that the industry also, not relying on the SIA, and I'm not saying they do, I think it's also the industry makes sure that its position is heard loud and clear by those who have got the capability to progress what we've been talking about. So I think I'd love to see, how could I say this? I'd love to see a movement where somebody was getting some companies together, some influential companies, to start to write their letter to the government. You imagine that, we see Infolog with all these companies on. How powerful would it be if some of those top companies, I don't mean top in terms of, in terms of the larger companies, if they were to put their letter to their signatures to a letter saying, as in a sector, we need business licensing.
I think you're right. Right, and a thing, I suppose my final thought on this is, Mark, thank you so much, Gary. Great questioning as ever. And yeah, I have to say that, otherwise it's contractual. He'll leave if I don't. But on a serious note, the ACS scheme is a vital tool. We need a regulator. If we didn't have the SIA, we would have to invent one. That much is clear. So I think, Mark, what you've just said now about the industry has got to find a unified voice to look after itself, and amongst its many disparate and different institutes, organizations, collaborations, etc., and just publish a letter that says, to start, let's get the ball rolling. Guest Safety Officer Lobby Group is here for the social economy, in terms of creating civilized space in the social economy, so that operators, venues can do business profitably because their customers feel able and welcome to come into their space and into this space.
So important.
Yeah. And so, but we need that voice amplifying, because it's Gary and me at the moment. It's going to be more by the end of this year, but it is just Gary and I, and obviously having guests like yourself on. So thank you, Mark. And
thank you very much, guys.
Goodbye,
and
everyone.
just to close,
Oh, sorry.
Just to close,
Sorry.
It's a little bit later here now. Working day's over. It's time for a beer by the pool.
I thought you said you got a call to do. That's not. See you later. Peace out.
1 second.
See you guys. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
1 second, Ian. Just remember, if you'd like to subscribe to this content, you like more, please either DM us or click the button below, and we can put more content out. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ian. And peace out.
Great chat, guys. See you.